let us talk about the types of polyphony available on the Arturia MiniFreak. Now, I've kind of put this off because Arturia has done some really interesting things that I don't entirely understand as a person who won't shut up about polyphony and articulation. It's funny that but it does seem like something we really need to explore. Okay, so let's be clear. The MiniFreak is a 6-note, 2-oscillator polyphonic synthesizer, which means that it is multiphonic. Now, if you'll remember multiphonic, you're probably like, oh, Mark, you just said polyphonic. Why are you saying multiphonic? It's really confusing because of the phonic addition and how this terrible mess happened. It's a long story, but polyphonic means how many notes a synthesizer plays at one time. How many notes can you play? Things like paraphonic and multiphonic address how the notes that you can play simultaneously are articulated by the different functions present in the synthesizer. So in a multiphonic synthesizer, you can play 6 notes, and each of those notes has its own amplifier, filter, and envelope, so that they can play. Each of those notes has their own filtering, their own amplitude. They're independent of each other. That's what multiphonic means. And paraphonic means that for no matter how many notes you have, originally it meant there was only one articulative structure, which is to say only one filter, one amp, and one envelope. So you could have, 100 notes, but they all went through a single filter, amp, and envelope. Now, things have gotten really crazy, and companies have kind of gone off the deep end with the concept of paraphonic. And it's really frustrating because no one really knows what paraphonic means as a result. And people think that it is a type of polyphony, like there's polyphonic and then there's paraphonic, when the truth of the matter is paraphonic is an articulative term. Polyphonic is a note count term. A synth that is paraphonic is also polyphonic. But when you hear that it's paraphonic, all you really know now, unfortunately, is that it doesn't quite play normally. And that's stupid. I'm sorry. But we need to invent new words to describe new situations. And I love Arturia with all of my heart. They are one of my favorite synthesizer companies of all time. Probably my, maybe even my favorite modern synthesizer company, but they have done what other companies have done in regard to the term paraphonic. And for these companies, what they're really just saying when they say paraphonic is there is a difference between note count and articulation for that note count. But they don't tell what the difference is. Paraphonic used to describe that there was a single filter, single amp, single envelope for all of the notes that they all had to share. And that was a great description. It was actually a misuse of the word, but it was a great misuse of the word. And now you don't know what you're going to get when they say paraphonic. You really don't. Whether it's a sub 37 that only plays 2 notes at a time, or this, which has a paraphonic function that is really technically a whole new architecture that has never existed before on Earth, using a term that used to describe a very specific function used by a lot of things, and then another thing that where it was coined, which meant something completely different. It is really silly how the term paraphonic has been misused. I'm sorry to make this whole video into a rant, but now I'm going to talk about articulation. But it's really important to sort of address these things. Okay, first we're going to go to monophonic, which is, of course, one note at a time. And that one note has its own filter, obviously, has a filter, an amp, and an envelope. Actually, as many envelopes as there's a cycling envelope, but there's this envelope. So basically, these functions, and it also has a second oscillator. So you have 2 oscillators, 1 filter, several envelopes. Just like a normal monophonic synthesizer would. But then we go to polyphonic. Now, polyphonic is 6 notes. Each note has its own. Okay, so we have 6 notes. Each note has 2 oscillators per note. Each note has its own envelope, its own filter, and its own amp, so that these notes can be played independently. And a good way to show this would be like to go to the filter here and put an envelope on it. Okay, so now each time I press a note, it will do the wow sound independently. On a paraphonic synth, that would not happen because you wouldn't have enough filters to have each note have its own filter, and that's the point of something that's paraphonic. But since we have 6 notes of polyphony, those are 6 articulated notes. It's a 6-note multiphonic, means each note has its own filter, its own amp, its own envelope or envelopes, and 2 oscillators. So then we move on to paraphonic, and this is bizarre. I have never heard of anything like this. When we go into the paraphonic mode, what is happening is suddenly you'll notice that both oscillator lights are on. That means we have lost oscillator 2 because oscillator 2 is now the oscillators associated with oscillator 2 are now part of our base oscillator set. What you need to think about is when we are in polyphonic, you have 2 oscillators per note, right? Well, that's still 2 oscillators. So what they've done is they've taken the second oscillator that would have been layered atop the first and then spread it out next to the other oscillators. So now we have 12 notes that you can play simultaneously. It becomes a 12-note polyphonic. Obviously, I don't have 12 fingers, so we only heard 10 notes. Now, what would normally happen in a true paraphonic is that after we played the first note, the filter would either go through its entire filter shape, this one, and each subsequent note wouldn't have its own filter and therefore would be subject to whatever the filter was doing based upon the first note that triggered the filter. So what we would not get is this. The other functionality that happens with paraphonic is that the filter is re-triggered every single time you play a new note. And then all of the previous notes that you're holding are all part of that re-triggering. So it sounds like they're being played again. We're also not getting that. In fact, this sounds like each of these notes has their own articulative structure, and somehow they've just made this a 12-note polyphonic multiphonic where everything now there's 12 filters or something. But that's not what's happening. They have this weird pairing system where you've got six pairs of notes, which is kind of consistent to what it's like when it's in its polyphonic setting. Except for those 2, so you've got 6 pairs of notes. So there are 2-note pairs, and each of those pairs have their own envelope somehow, but they're also sharing an envelope, a secondary envelope. So the articulation is weird and not exactly the same as it would be if each of these notes were individually articulated. I don't understand it because, like, as I'm sitting, this does not exhibit the behaviors that when you're playing a true paraphonic, you'd be like, oh, yep, there's the filter covering all the notes. I'm trying to play notes while I'm holding notes, and now the filter's closed. You're not getting any of those things that a paraphonic synth does. In fact, it's really hard to find what exactly is happening just by playing this. And maybe there are ways that you could play it where it would reveal, like, oh yeah, that's not how a normal multiphonic would be articulated. But to me, I mean, basically they've figured out some sort of trick to make it seem like their not fully articulated per 12 note structure sounds like it is, which is great. That's really awesome. But I would beg them, please don't call this paraphonic. Come up with a new name for it. because we have held notes that have gone through their filter envelope structure, and then we're playing new notes that have new filter envelope articulations. So that's not normal. This is a special type of articulation that makes it sound not paraphonic. So I would really beg that not be the term. Anyway, then we go on to unison, and what unison is it's where all 12 oscillators are put on a single note. And it makes this really cool sound. And it's monophonic, so all the notes are on one. And there are options to mess around with it and make it more interesting, or basically tailor it to suit your tastes. One of them is, I don't know if you ever played a Juno 106, but I remember pressing the unison button, and basically it just turned into this big unusable punch in the face, which this sounds good. And it's because they've done this. See, if you go into Sound Edit, go down to Voice, then we go down to Unispread. What this does is it separates all of the different notes from each other, so that you get variations, pitch variations, which sound like chorusing at first. And then the further you go, the more the notes get too far away from the note to really be a single note, which is a cool effect. And then you start getting chords. That's a lot of notes happening at once. Eventually, you get to these octaves. Because this is a spread of octaves. Is this 12? It can't be 12 octaves. It's a lot. So that's cool. So you get to decide what your unison notes, all of these different oscillators, are doing. Now, is it 6? And maybe it's 6 and I don't know. Anyway. So the other thing you can do with Uni is unison count. This, you have 6 notes. Okay, so I guess it is 6. But you can make it less. You can get down to 2. So then if you went back to Unispread, it would just be these 2 notes. Or not. Oh, interesting. Did we get out of what I said we were on? Okay, we are on 2. So then if we go to, maybe this is a bug, Unispread. It sounds like it's not staying on 2. Am I doing that wrong? All right, then we go to unison spread. And now we have 2 notes. So you can make unison into fifths or fourths or octaves or whatever. Also, unison mode, there is a uni-poly. You'll notice that since I turned this on, it's now polyphonic, which is a sort of allocation, I think, of the polyphony, so that the notes are covering as many, all of the notes that you have are covering as many of the notes that you're playing, if that makes sense. We should also talk about, in monophonic, there is a thing where each time you play a note, if you're holding a note, it re-triggers anyway. But like the mini mode used to be, If you hold a note, you're not re-triggering the filter and envelope and everything. And so you can articulate the filter slash envelope by each new note you play, but if you hold a note, you don't get that articulation. But yes, so that is basically the polyphonic situation that you have with the MiniFreak. That is a lot of options. That's super powerful. And you can also even program how the notes of polyphony are allocated by digging into the sound edit section. So look into that as well. And yeah, so the polyphony, monophony, unisonification is it's strong in this synthesizer. This is the Arturia MiniFreak.